Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us for this session of the Shift Live. A few housekeeping bits we'll go through in just 1 second, but I just want to say thank you for being here. And if it's your first time joining us for a Shift Live, then welcome. It's great to have you here. If you have been with us before, then it's great to see you back here again. To give you a little bit of a background as to what the Shift Live is and who Blink is. Blink is the employee experience app that's reconnecting frontline workers to their wider organizations. And the Shift Live is a webinar series that we run to tackle all sorts of frontline communication, connectivity, digital access challenges, and to bring together experts in the space to help you guys work out how you can better connect your organizations and therefore bring lots of great benefits into the workplace. The one that we're here to speak about today, obviously, is internal communications and digital engagement. At Blink, we're really proud of the fact that we've helped some of our customers to reach 95% of their employees. So that's frontline workers as well as desk-based workers. Obviously, there are other benefits of using an employee app like Blink, but internal comms is the thing that we're here to speak about today, and we're not even here to speak about Blink. So I'm going to stop talking about us now, and I will pass over to Simon in just 1 second, who is going to introduce the panel and get everything started. Just a few housekeeping bits and pieces before we do get started. You will see down the bottom of your screen in the right-hand side, there's a little chat feature. If you'd like to say hello, let us know where you're from, then that is great. That's exactly what you can use that for. Obviously, this is an Ask Me Anything event as well. So the questions that the panel are going to go on to talk about have been brought to us by you, which is great. Thank you so much for those of you who did send in questions ahead of time. But of course, we are going to save some time towards the end of the session, maybe 10 minutes or so, to talk about questions that you might have as the event goes on. So you can use the questions tab at the bottom there to chuck any questions at us. We'll keep an eye on it for the whole time. And if we've got time to get through everyone's questions, we absolutely will. If we don't, we'll try and get back to you with answers from the panel as well. So that is everything from me. I'm going to hand over to Simon now. Thank you.
Hey everybody, thank you Lauren for the introduction. It's great to be here today. My name is Simon White. I lead the people team here at Blink. So that's a pretty big responsibility because I lead the people team at a company which is trying to build a product to help employers and leaders connect with their people. So it's a huge responsibility, one I absolutely love. I've been here for about 18 months. And my background before Blink is that I did actually work in frontline industry. So I worked in the manufacturing sector for a number of years before moving to the tech industry about a decade ago now. So a very long time in tech. I'm really pleased to have Susie and Zach with me today. Susie, can I hand over to you first? Do you want to tell us who you are and what you're bringing to the panel today?
Yeah, sure. Hello, everybody. It's lovely to be here. I'm Susie Robinson. I've been in the world of intranets and internal communications for a very long time now. I don't really like to think about the number, but actually in my previous iteration before I was a consultant, I worked with different organisations that all had different sorts of frontline workers. So retail, hospitality industry were the two big ones. Now I am a consultant with Clearbox Consulting. We help people with their digital workplace needs, which includes things like intranets and frontline worker tools, and doing things like internal comms audits and helping people with governance and things like that.
Fantastic. It's great to have you here today, Susie. And then slightly geographically further away, we've got Zach. Zach, do you want to introduce yourself and tell us what you're bringing today?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everybody, for having me. Zach Hauser, presently the Director of Culture and Communications with Lara Caring, which is a skilled home health organization in the United States in about 17 states. My background is in integrated marketing communications and corporate communications, primarily in the healthcare sector for the past decade. So excited to be here, and hope to answer anything that might be you might be noodling on.
Fantastic. Thank you, Zach. Great to have you with us today. And as Lauren said, you've asked some really insightful questions before the session. And what we're going to try and do is get through as many of them thematically as we can and try and bring you hopefully as much insight as possible. Susie, I'm going to come to you first because you said that you've been working in this space for a while. The first question we actually have is, what have been some of the biggest changes you've seen in communicating with employees, and in this case specifically deskless employees?
Yes, so I started working with a retail business and working the internal communication side of things pre-mobile phones, which seems like forever ago now, but it wasn't that long really. It's only really been the last 10 years that smartphones have been a common thing for people to carry around in their pockets. And actually it was kind of a few years after that, more like 2015, that it was really, really common. So I had to try and reach a retail workforce without having a variety of different channels to actually reach them with. So we relied a lot on paper, we relied a lot on line managers, and I had an intranet as well, which slowly was rolled out on mobile over time as well. So really the biggest thing that I've seen with changes wise has been that evolution of technology, the fact that there are all sorts of different channels now, and also changes of attitudes. People are more willing to use their personal devices than they were before for business purposes, to the extent that some people will try and find their own apps to do their own things at businesses where there aren't kind of official tools to do it. So that's been a huge shift that I've seen over the last about 15 years or so.
Absolutely, that technological boom is definitely eye-opening. I used to work in a car factory, and yeah, the idea of a shared computer between 100 to 200 employees wasn't that outside the realms of possibility. And as you say now, we're carrying around more powerful computers in the palm of our hands, and more importantly, Susie, as you say, willing to use them, right, and willing to use them to engage at work. That's fantastic. And Zach, let's come to you then, because we've got people willing to use them, right? We've got people willing to engage with technology and people willing to absorb content. But coming at this from the role that you play, how do we ensure that that content is engaging, and how do we ensure that it hits that right beat?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think in the clinical space in particular, depending on the role or where the employee is, they really receive content in a very different capacity. So some of our nurses, for example, are on tablets, which is why we use Blink to have those discussions with them. Other parts of our workforce don't even have an email. So we have to really strategically align on not just the messaging. The message can be great, but working with IT and identifying what the touch points are that our employees are going to be able to get to the information and resources, pay, benefits, et cetera, and then really setting up those strategies with our leaders well in advance to make sure that we can meet the mark and ensure people are seeing what the message is. That's really important from what I've seen, particularly from a clinician's perspective, since they're with patients all day and they have maybe, 20 minutes dedicated to email. So we've had to pivot quite often and think outside the box.
Fantastic. And in that 20 minutes, Zach, how do we get people to participate in that communication? How have you found a way to make that a two-way process at Alara?
So recently, we've really stepped up our game in the multimedia section. We found that our post analytics on Blink, or even some of our data and insights, are showing that folks want to have that closed loop. They want to offer communications via open forums. Static comms are not meeting the mark. So identifying content that we can have short video snippets that can go out to the app about their pay raise, for example, and directly link to a resource that shows them which regions are impacted and where they can go to for questions. So it's been, as Susie had mentioned, with the advent or the evolution of technology, factoring in what kind of new channels we can use to improve content engagement and make it more dynamic, I think is the best way to do it. They really respond well to dynamic content that's short, sweet, and they can move about their day.
Fantastic. And Susie, I know that one of the areas that you're particularly passionate about is the role of managers in that communication. So what do you see as the role of managers in getting that communication out to these deskless workers?
I think that there have been studies that suggest that people trust their line managers a huge deal, and that can increase from organization to organization. So in some places, it actually that's the channel that people trust the most when it comes to formal communications or activities that need to be done. And so their role in that communications process can't be underestimated. And doing things to support them, to help them facilitate those sorts of conversations, giving them information that will allow them to break down bigger pieces of news into smaller chunks and almost have like a briefing pack that they can then pass on, actually treating them as their own audience and as their own group of people to communicate to in a slightly different way, can be really helpful, and is something that I would do in my previous roles, was to actually target them with very specific pieces of information that just gave them that additional support. And going back to your previous question about that two-way aspect as well, allowing them to feel that they were free to open and ask questions and get responses in return as well. Of course, that's a huge part of the two-way aspect. Is it does need to be two-way, and there does need to be someone there who will respond to any questions. But giving them that additional support then meant that they were much more reliable from our perspective as a comms team, much more reliable source to actually then go and pass on communication to the rest of the organization.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I remember when I was working in the frontline industries, one of the things I often found with leaders was they almost didn't want to ask the question because they didn't almost want the answer, right? They didn't want to have that dialogue or have that communication. And some words that would come up were around empowerment or confidence. Susie, what are some of the ways you've empowered leaders or given leaders the confidence to engage in that communication?
I think it's the approach that you should take with any communications, really, is to be open and honest and authentic as well with the messages that are going out. And so being there and approaching communications from the perspective that you understand your audience. So matter what it is you're communicating or who you're communicating to, actually showing that you understand who you're talking to is really important. And when it comes to line managers, showing and acknowledging that you know that they're busy, you know that they have people to manage, you know they're going to be the ones that get some of these questions. So here's the answers in advance, or here's how you go about asking those questions so that you can then find the answer to pass on to your direct report. It's setting up all those sorts of things that you do on a larger scale for the whole channel, the whole audience, but actually really focusing in on them and understanding their needs. And I'm a great supporter of sending people out to the front line, and actually going out for day trips and going and working at locations and doing some of those roles as line managers or shadowing someone and seeing what their day-to-day really is like, and how long they do have to read emails or how long they do have to read their intranet or their employee app, whatever it might be, so that then you can think, well, if I've only got them for 5 minutes at the beginning of the day, how can I get those messages out to them in an effective way so that they can then support what we're trying to do?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think there's the level to it as well, which is if you're a desk-based manager who spends all of your time communicating and engaging through a desktop process like a laptop or a computer, even just spending that experience of what does it feel like to absorb this information on a 6-inch screen? Right? What does it feel like to absorb this? Or Zach, your example, to absorb this on a tablet that you get 20 minutes to look at in the middle of a shift. It's not only, I guess, the experience of the work, but it's the experience of being engaged, which actually changes for the deskless worker as well. Zach, what about at Alara? When you guys moved towards this digital engagement work, did you do any work for managers or leaders, or have you done anything since then to help your leaders get comfortable in that space?
Yeah, so what I've noticed in my short time here is that the downstream communications aren't necessarily meeting the mark. So it's incumbent upon us as a communications team to go, as Susie kind of mentioned, either through ride-alongs or otherwise culture surveys to identify the pain points, not only for the team members, for the managers. The ride-alongs can help significantly, but it has to be a promise delivered. So it can't be more information to come soon. You have to go to the managers and say, here's our change management communications for this new technology rollout or for this new benefits package. Communicate Open enrollment, seems simple, but very, very complex among 17 states. So meeting with each regional branch from Kansas to, up in the Northeast and Rhode Island, what are their needs? What are their team demographics? And the content needs to align with that, because the benefits and the content that you're putting out there changes vastly. And we're a small but mighty team, so we pride ourselves on being able to get directly with managers to get that input and not rely on the executive vice presidents or C-suite downstream, but go straight to the people to get the content that we need. There's a variety of ways to do that, but just being efficient and doing that and delivering. From a comms team, if you can deliver, then you get that buy-in from the managers, and they feel like, it's not a soft asset. This has a lot of value to assist with employee retention and engagement, which is where we meet the bottom line, which is great.
Fantastic. And a lot of what we're trying to replace or update here is what would have historically happened on a notice board, right? A lot of the way we engaged frontline workers or communicated or deskless workers was notice boards. And I guess the jump from a notice board to, Zach, you used the word multimedia a few minutes ago, right? That's a big leap. Talk us through, like, what are some of the forms of multimedia that you find to be the most effective at Elara, and why do you think they've been successful?
Yeah, it's kind of nebulous, multimedia, right? So I kind of throw in that arena, like anything that we can use app engagement, even on the open forums. Obviously, you have your digital snippets, which do really well for us when we look at the Blink app and see the engagement. We know that people like any sort of GIF or like internal messaging movement. They're just going to be more attracted to it. But beyond that, like using leveraging our text messaging capabilities, trying to identify synergies among our internal application and our ServiceNow partnership to see not only what is the key messaging, but where am I headed today as a clinician for scheduling? How can we give that in bite-sized pieces to the person so they have like almost a daily synopsis of what's ahead for them? And again, having the managers buy-in to get that to the ground level, it's really important. So I see it as multimedia being very comprehensive beyond the video state. And we like to think outside the box here. And I'm always welcoming new ideas from the team.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this society, right, that's how we absorb content every day, right? If you're on Instagram, you're seeing photos. If you're on X, you're seeing text. If you're on Snapchat, or if you're on TikTok, you're seeing short form video. So we're living in a multimedia society that we're emulating in work, which is super interesting. Susie, one of the areas that can be, I guess, daunting about that world, though, is which one do I use, right? I've got 10 different options of how to communicate this and which is the best one. What's been your approach to kind of finding the best way to communicate certain messages?
I would say it comes down to two things, one of which is your audience and one of which is the content itself. So as you've just said, the way that we consume content all the time is through short form videos and GIFs and that sort of thing. But that's also how we consume content all the time. And so sometimes there can be an element of fatigue that comes in if you're constantly trying to do videos about every single thing. If every single leader is doing a 5-minute quick chat as they're walking to their car or to the office in the morning, it can be great, but it can also be overwhelming, particularly if you're starting out with trying to get people onto the platform and maybe they're feeling a little bit overwhelmed by suddenly having something on their personal device that they're trying to get used to. And so that's where thinking about who are we trying to communicate with, maybe thinking about what is the mix of demographics that are there. How actually do people prefer to absorb information? Some groups of people may prefer infographics, whereas other groups may like videos, whereas others may prefer just really simple bullet points or something along those lines. And then again, looking at the content and seeing what's most appropriate for what's going out. And in some cases, absolutely, video is king and it will be the best thing that can be produced, but in some cases that won't be right, and it's not fair on the audience to just use a medium because it's kind of popular amongst kind of internal comms folk. We do love trends and trying new things, but the audience needs to be front of mind to make sure that the message really does hit home in the best kind of ways.
And one thing I would add to that just quickly, because I think it's a great point, is like we've set up a communications intake form, which is a crude way of having project management, but really challenging your managers or your subject matter experts to think critically about how they want the message created. So turn it into a collaboration with them, and in so doing, earn their trust. Like they're willing as a comms team to work with me and discuss the multimedia options, or discuss whether it's an email complement with a blink post on top of it. Have them be part of the process, which really gets buy-in, because they don't see comms as just something that is a delivered message. They then start seeing it holistically and how it impacts the larger business strategy. That's what I would offer as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you, Zach. And we had a number of questions around this theme, around, does it change if you're communicating to frontline manufacturing workers? Does it change if you're communicating to international workforces? Susie, you've talked a lot about the audience, right? And getting to know the audience. Are there any themes or tricks and tips to know about how you get to know those groups? Or is it really just about getting to know the individuals in your workforce and finding the right method?
I think, ideally you'd get to know them, but I think that can also be a challenge, particularly in frontline organisations that typically are very, very large, and sometimes can be really geographically spread, so it would just be impractical to do that. I think that's where local communications people will come in really helpful, and if there aren't any formal comms people, there will probably be people who are supporters of comms or want to see improvements there, and so will be good sounding boards just to kind of gauge a bit of insight into local cultures and preferences. One of the organisations I work for was a global hotel chain. And so the ways that people would use different tools and react to different messages really did vary. And so understanding whether that's something that's applicable in your organization, whether it's just as simple as, is there anything context-wise I need to know that's going on in that location? Like, is half of the staff being made redundant? If they are, do I really want to go out with this really chirpy message, because it's just not going to land very well if it's something that's just not relevant at this time? So it's sort of making sure you have that spread of understanding and those ways to tap in. If you're a very small internal comms team, that's really, really important to know that you can go out and have people you can rely on, and be seen to be doing that as well. Be seen as someone who is very open, as Zach's already said, to work collaboratively and encourage those conversations, encourage people to come to you and offer them your advice as well as taking their advice from them as well, is how I would approach it.
That's great. And Zach, you mentioned earlier about, with Alara Carrying, the organization you're with, you're across multiple states and multiple parts of the country. Have you seen any different trends in how people are reacting or absorbing content?
Yeah, depending on what the content is. And you have to think of the disparity we're in the Northeast and the South, so I'll spare the political ideology, but you have to think about your people. So one message about nursing unions in one area is not going to resonate as well as it may elsewhere. So there's a lot of nuance that goes without saying, and you have to be extremely granular and strategic about which particular groups within, this target audience do we need this message to go to. And again, back to what Susie was saying and kind of what I mentioned, the collaboration among leaders to help them see the light or have self-identification and how this could be off-putting for a reader, which then down the road keeps them from coming back to your communications, which limits engagement. So everything has to be so precise, I think. And that's why communications is such a vital role, because you have to have that social emotional intelligence and the understanding of thinking in terms of chess, not checkers. How will this impact our more important comms down the road if they find this off-putting or not relevant? So that is something across states, across, messaging that we have to be aware of. And I really try to preach that or work on that with our leadership at the C-suite and just below, and then at the branch level too.
Something that I think is worthwhile mentioning, actually, that's just come into my head is around different languages. That's a huge variable, and can make a massive difference between how a piece is absorbed by someone. And automatic translation is fantastic, but it does have its kind of limitations. And so allowing people to understand maybe where there is a difference between something that's automatically translated, and so they might be missing some of the nuances behind some of the messaging, versus maybe, again, as Zach's mentioned as well, the kind of strategic thinking about what is so important. We know we should get this translated professionally and actually shared in another language, so that it hits much more appropriately for that audience. And sometimes there may be an official company language. Quite often it is English, because it's the one that's typically spoken the most across different organizations. But that doesn't mean that everybody's most comfortable speaking in English either. And so just having that knowledge of your workforce and knowing, actually, yes, we may technically speak English, but 75% of us speak Chinese or speak Spanish or speak a completely different language. Actually, this message is so important, we're going to invest that time in getting it translated. And those kind of little things can actually make a really big difference and show that you do care about the audiences you're communicating with.
Yeah, absolutely. No, some really valuable points there. Thank you for that. And obviously, Zach and Susie, one of the things, that we're talking a lot today is about, creating content when you have a platform, or when you have a tool, or when you have an app that you can use to communicate with your workforces. But we shouldn't underestimate the cost of that, right? The cost to the organization to make that change, the cost to actually buy a product. Zach, if we come to you maybe first on this one, what would be your advice for how people can approach starting this conversation in their businesses, approaching senior leadership and saying, hey, we want to buy a platform, we want to start this process?
It's a really great question, and no easy route sometimes, but I'm encouraged by where folks are headed in terms of adopting and recognizing the period of time we're in, where with these new existing technologies. I think it starts with wherever you come in, within your company, is what is the engagement and retention like? For communications, for my particular role, we're baked into the people team, or HR. So we know, or at least I know, that strategically speaking, any KPIs related to communications are going to directly correlate or be able to be crosswalked with engagement and retention. If employees feel heard, as you mentioned earlier, if they feel like they're in the know, that they're able to engage and have information about their benefits, how to do their job better, education opportunities, career development opportunities, all of this, it's the tide raising all boats. So it brings that point up for engagement and retention. And so we spend less on trying to maintain, a workforce, and we're recruiting and growing. So that's the crossover for me. And as we see it with the internal Blink app, we have this highly transient population who don't have emails. We know they're 45% of our workforce, and they matter too, and they're a vastly different audience. But we have to reach them with critical messaging, making them feel like even though they're non-clinical, that they're very much a part of this larger shift in this movement. They're very much a part of the organization. So we had to think outside the box, and that's why we went with Blink, because it's a very hard audience to reach, and a very diverse audience, as Susie was mentioning, different languages, different demographics, socio-demographics. So you have to do that, but then show the numbers. Ultimately, this will move the needle on engagement and retention, because employees are going to stay with us longer.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's what we're here to talk about, right? Creating that engagement. So that's really pertinent. Thank you. Susie, Zach touched upon, right? There's lots of solutions, there's lots of thought process, and lots of things to consider. What are some of the things that you would encourage a business to consider when thinking about maybe adopting a digital platform or putting something in place?
So this is something that we help clients with a lot. And actually one of the reasons why I know Blink is, for the last few years, I've reviewed Blink alongside other products. And one of the things that we then go on to do is help people think about how to choose the right product or products for their organization. I think Zach mentioned the people strategy, which is absolutely a vital aspect to understand. But actually there are all sorts of strategies across a business. And for frontline work workforce oriented businesses, it's quite often operations. That's another important department that will have a big steer in the decision about how their workers will be doing various things. And then there's also the digital workplace or IT strategy as well. And IT will have their own views on what tools should be used for what, maybe what already exists or where there are some gaps as well. So those three strategies are important to understand, as well as how they align as part of the broader business strategy overall. What are the goals of the business over the next few years, and how do those three departments fit into that? And then from there, you can work out your own strategy for what it is you want to achieve and how it will support the needs of those different parts of the business, how it will support those different strategic areas. And if you can prove that there is a gap, you can prove that there is something that will meet that gap and help you achieve that strategy and ultimately the business achieve the strategic goals, it's a much easier conversation to have with senior leaders, because they can understand, we want to improve employee retention by this percentage, as opposed to we'd really like to be able to share news with our people. Tying it back to what matters to them is a really good way of getting that buy-in. And alongside that, we've talked about the people a lot as well, is understanding your audience, understanding what it is they need and what they want from a tool like Blink or an intranet, or if it's Microsoft Teams or if it's Google Workplace, whatever it is that you end up using, is what is it do they want to achieve? Where are the pain points, as Zach's mentioned before, that could be solved by a tool? And doing that research, it can be as formal or informal and as long-winded or as short-winded as you like, to gather that feedback, but actually dropping in quotes from people and dropping in, we found out that this number of people find this difficult to do, again, is another way to really argue your point with senior leaders to say, we know that all of these people struggle to do this, so let's make it easier for them to do that. And then at the same time, show them some news, and that, almost having that as something they do on the way to doing practical tasks, is a good buy-in.
Yeah. And as an HR leader, one of the things I found over the years with any sort of digital engagement or bringing in any sort of software in this sense, it's about moving the narrative away from this would be nice to have. Right, you said, Susie, it'd be great to be able to communicate with people. Right, is not the message that's necessarily going to land this level of investment or this level of change management. Zach, as you said, it's how do you tie it to the bottom line? How do you make it that this is essential? Right, engaging our frontline workforce or our deskless workforce is essential because it drives productivity, it drives staff engagement, it drives staff, well-being and happiness, rather than this sort of nice to have or add-on mentality we sometimes have with these platforms. So definitely changing the narrative and changing the the confidence that we as HR leaders bring around this software, I think, is really, really critical as well. And then, as we've talked about already, and we're going to talk about more because we've had lots more questions on this topic, how do we then give the business the confidence that we'll use it and use it well? Right, so you're going to invest in this software, that's great, but how do we then use it well, and how do we take it forward? One of the areas we had a really interesting question on, I'm going to come to you first on this one, Zach, because I'd love to hear if you've had any firsthand experience of this at Elara. There's a question about how do you make sure that everybody can interact with the platform, or everybody can interact with this digital engagement. So rather than just maybe a handful of maybe louder voices, making sure that everybody in the organization has at least the opportunity to connect. How have you gone about in your rollout at Elara really focusing on that inclusion piece?
It's a fantastic question because of what we've discussed before. And just in the interest of full disclosure, we have so many communications mechanisms. So you have to push why this ecosystem works, like a intranet or, an internal engagement app. So I mentioned that personal care services division earlier. It's their one source of truth. They have to use it. But you're right. Like, it's harder for home health divisions or physicians to jump on something else when they will say to us, we have Teams, we have Outlook, we have the intranet, I have text. Why this? So you really have to work with those teams for two things, I think. The value propositions, because we know they're there, solidifying what they can't get access to elsewhere, and why this one-stop shop is going to be helpful, as Susie mentioned earlier, to your corporate goals. I think fleshing those out with your subject matter experts is really helpful. And then the second part of this is we're about to launch into is a adoption campaign, and in earnest, not just lip service, but getting to the manager level, putting out collateral. Here's what you can do on the internal app that you can't do elsewhere. You have to show them the way. So I think that's really important. And I hope that helps a little bit in guiding your strategy, because people like to get information in many different places. You have to show them that this is worth their while.
Yeah, that's a really interesting approach, Zach. So have you had any pushback or any negativity about the fact that you've kind of driven communication to one channel?
Well, maybe come back to me in Q1 next year. No, I think it's not. There has been pushback because, again, the audience being what it is, you got tech agnostic folks, you got tech adept folks, you got people who just don't want emails, just text them. I mean, I was reading survey comments before I got on this call about all this stuff, and you try to come up with the right strategy. And I think what you have to do is you have to say to folks, like, if there is pushback, it's like, again, yes, I hear you. We could use channels, but those are siloed and somewhat disparate. Here's a marketplace of ideas where all team members can break down silos, give each other kudos, acknowledge one another, get the news they need. That doesn't exist elsewhere outside of an internal app. The email communications through MailChimp, Constant Contact, Email Open will always exist and be a complement to your internal app. But nowhere else, in my estimation, does a ecosystem exist like that where everyone can interact. We really have to be strategic about the buy-in and then the implementation and rollout, which is what we're about to undergo here.
Wow. Yeah, and one of the things that I've been most impressed with since I started using the Blink app actually is, I think historically we tried to push people towards single channels of communication, but it was a different channel than everything else, right? It was like, hey, go here to find out everything you need from your employer, but then go here to get your rota, and go here to get your payslip, and go here to get your forms. And actually, when we think about creating digital engagement via a platform like Blink, which is designed to be this kind of digital front door, we're actually saying, hey, get your entire engagement with your employer through this one place, right? So it's not just the one app that tells you what your manager wants you to know. That's the same app where you get your schedule. It's the same app where you get your information. It's the same app where you get your pay stub. So really driving that idea of digital engagement through habit and in one place, rather than this maybe siloed approach that historically we tried that at least in my experience, maybe just wasn't so successful. So yeah, really driving that habit of adoption, I think, is really critical as well.
Yeah, and that works particularly well for the frontline as well, I think, is having everything in the one place for them. If you go down the route of having multiple different apps that people have to download to their personal devices, they're just going to say no at some point, or they'll do it, but they won't necessarily know which one they're supposed to use where. So having those things that they really care about, like a pay slip, or like being able to book their holiday days or something along those lines within the place where they also find out the information that is nice for them to know, is a good way of kind of serving both of those needs. But also then recognizing that maybe desk-based workers may have a slightly different approach, that actually meeting them where they work is also important. And so having a tool that allows you to maybe send a message or just to prompt them to go and have a look at Blink, or whatever it may be, is also beneficial for that group that exists in all organizations as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things we haven't touched upon very much actually in our conversation so far is that one of the reasons that you, at least in my experience, you drive engagement is to try and feel that feeling of being part of a community, being part of something bigger than yourself, or being part of a group that's bigger than yourself. Susie, how have you seen companies effectively use digital engagement to combat like feelings of loneliness or feelings of disconnection from employers?
I mean, the last few years has been a good testing time. There have been some really interesting case studies that come out of that. One of the ones that I really like was Transport for London, who look after buses and tubes and trains in the London area for those who aren't UK based. And they had a chat tool that they used quite a lot before the pandemic hit. And one of the things that they would run through this engagement tool was what they called the Underground in Bloom, which was a competition where people would share photos of their train stations or their bus stops, whatever it was, to show the flower displays that there were at these particular stations. When COVID hit, obviously a lot of the transport was reduced right down. People weren't working the shifts that they were used to working. And so Transport for London switched what they were doing, still ran the competition.
Oh, I think we may have lost Susie. She was having some connection issues earlier, and she'd got through about 40 minutes, and then unfortunately we've just lost her. So we'll see if we can get her back. Zach, same question to you. How have you gone about building community or internal feeling of belonging using a platform?
Yeah, it's a really great question. I start with our culture pulse survey. I really try to identify what the disconnects are and the feeling of, you mentioned, what are the isolation points, or what are team members not feeling a part of, because it's no one left behind as much as you can. So I think that's working with your people team, as I know you know, and getting those insights. But then operationally, what are some of the barriers, and then simplifying your content, because trying to get folks generally on board initially is super important. And I think, again, like, just to reiterate, the buy-in is super important, but you can get there. You just have to make it frictionless and easy for these team members to use, because with all these options out there, you get a very small window, in my estimation, to get it right. You want it to not be a pain point. You want it to be frictionless and make it so they feel like they can do their jobs more effectively, and they know how to take care of themselves and their loved ones. Those two value points are really important. So I think that's how I think we start with engagement, and then we get more sophisticated as we go along once our numbers go up.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't think, I don't think it's the sole reason to install a platform like this, but we definitely shouldn't underestimate the importance of this area. It's a bit of a stereotype, but working in HR, you often have this kind of this assumed persona of the scary HR person. And it's amazing how many people, come up and talk to me at companies I've worked at since I post in, dog groups, right? And I'm like, hey, I've got 2 dogs. And then people are like, oh, you're a human being, right? You've got dogs. Let's talk about that. Yeah. So that humanizing and community engagement piece, we definitely shouldn't underestimate it at all. It's not the reason, but it's a reason as to why these platforms can be so important to really bringing that engagement. Zach, we're very close to time. We've got about 2 minutes left. And the most asked question, and probably the hardest question to answer, was, and Susie, you're back just in time for our final question. We've got 1 minute each for you both. Zach, what's the secret sauce? What's your top tip for driving digital engagement in a deskless organization?
It's going to sound cliche, but honestly, never being close-minded and being willing to adapt in any situation. And despite change comms coming at the last minute and then wanting you to post it on the internal app, or you're getting things that needed to be communicated a month out, like 2 days before, being adaptable and flexible, and realizing, as you mentioned, people are human beings who just do not understand the importance of internal comms. So there's a sense of reconditioning and collaboration, but sincerely, it's reconditioning. It's getting people to look at the scope of integrated marketing communications and corporate comms and realize just how much of an impact it has. So it's a cultural shift, almost a paradigm shift. So the secret sauce is getting that buy-in from leaders and showing, okay, like, here's how communications impact your operations, our people team, everything. And here I have the numbers to support through the internet how that communication that we just threw out in a haste did. relative to this one that we had 6 months in advance to plan for, and look how many kudos we got for it. So that to me that would be my secret sauce.
Cool. And Susie, just very briefly, your secret sauce, your top tip to finish us off today.
Very briefly, I will finish my story and answer in the same breath. So Transport for London refocused and did it as a garden-based thing for people who were growing things at home, which allowed them to share their own stories and reconnect with everybody, very much like joining a webinar, rejoining a webinar. So that feeling of connection between people was hugely valuable for them during that period. But that also meant that when they started to share videos and photos and updates about the new tube line that opened, there was a reason for them for people to go onto the platform to share their own stories, to share their own insights, to get that feeling of connection, and then at the same time see this quite practical stuff and get involved in it and get involved in the conversation. So I think my tip would be to not underestimate the need for either the kind of pure engagement, fluffy thing some people may feel it is, and also the very practical and helpful things. There's a real blend that you can come up with and utilize to really get people to engage with your platform.
Fantastic. And just before I hand back to Lauren, my top tip here is, and it's a quote I read very recently, but it really brought together a number of thoughts I've been having over the last little while. Nobody has ever left a company because they have too much information or because their employer is too transparent. Right. And that's, for me, the key to creating digital engagement in a deskless, in a desk-based organization. Platforms, however you choose to do it, brings information to people. And if you can bring information, it will likely lead to them being happier, better, more engaged in their workplace. And those can only be good things, as Zach and Susie have given us countless examples of today. I want to say a big thank you to Zach and Susie, really, really engaged panel members, some great insights from very, very different backgrounds, but hopefully a really diverse group of information today, and hopefully some really helpful nuggets of information for people to take away. I'm going to hand back to Lauren to finish us off today.
Well, thank you to you as well, Simon. And yes, thank you, Zach. Thank you, Susie. I've been taking frantic notes, loads of great sound bites. And yeah, I hope those of you who have joined and listened to it live have taken something away. For those of you watching this back as a recording, I hope you did as well. Just to finish us off, I just wanted to quickly let you know about the next webinar that we already have lined up, continuing on the same conversation, Wednesday the 18th of October, so in 6 weeks or so. We're going to be talking about all of the best practices, all of the tips, all the tricks, all of the secret sauce that we've been discussing in this conversation in really practical terms, how that has worked for aggregate industries, a business with a very big frontline workforce. So please do join us for that session in a few weeks' time. We'd love to see you there. I'm also just going to drop into the chat here. I mentioned this is part of a series called The Shift Live. We also have a newsletter that goes out every 2 weeks. It's actually going out this Thursday. So if you haven't signed up to the Shift newsletter, do that. You'll receive something in your inbox from us on Thursday. And that is all of the shameless plugs from me. So just another big thank you to everyone who joined. Thank you to the panelists. And yeah, we will see you all very soon. Thank you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
guys.
Thanks.